Difference in food standards in the U.S. versus Europe. Agencies responsible for food standards. For the U.S., the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, they oversee all food and safety and labeling, as well as additives, besides meat, poultry, and some egg products. USDA, United States Department of Agriculture. They regulate meat, poultry, and egg products. For Europe, they have the EFSA, European Food Safety Authority. They provide independent scientific advice on food-related risks, as well as non-existing and emerging food risks. European Commission, DG Sante, enforces food safety laws and standards across Europe and other member countries. History and background information. For the U.S., the FDA was created to enforce the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. FDA established to ensure food safety, driven by scandals over unsafe and mislabeled foods. Focus on science-based standards and consumer protection, but allow more chemicals and additives compared to Europe. For Europe, food regulations strengthened after crises like mad cow disease in the 1900s. EFSA was created in 2002 to restore consumer trust. Focus on the precautionary principle. If something might be harmful, it can be restricted even without full scientific proof.
Regulations in the US and in Europe when it comes to foods. So one regulation is pesticides. So in the US, we have less strict regulations when it comes to pesticides in our foods, but in Europe, they tend to have more strict limits when it comes to pesticides. And then another regulation is organic farming and GMOs. So in the US, the FDA does allow genetically modified foods, but without specific labeling requirements. While in the EU, it has stricter regulations on genetically modified foods, and they do require specific labeling. Also, for organic farming, in Europe, it is more widespread and is very carefully monitored. But if you look in the US, you'll tend to see that organic farming does exist, but it's just like less monitored. Also, another regulation is food labeling. So in the US, it's more readable and just like easier to understand, with the key information being larger and in a bolder font. Also, if you look at like an oatmeal box in the US, you'll see that there's just like unnecessary ingredients and just like chemicals that just shouldn't be on there. But if you look at an oatmeal box in Europe, you'll see that it's just like easier to read, and it just like makes sense. But a negative about foods labeling in Europe is that they tend to have smaller fonts with just like less spacing, and like some of the ingredients are not friendly for young kids. Specific ingredient restrictions. Red dye 3 is a food coloring that is suspected to be cancerous and is banned in Europe, but it's still used in the US. Potassium bromate helps improve the texture of bread, but it's banned in the EU, China, India, and it's also banned in some United States due to its concerns of possibly becoming cancerous, but it's not fully banned in the United States. Another ingredient restriction is titanium dioxide. This is a coloring agent used as a whitener. It is banned in Europe due to its safety concerns, but it's still used in food products like candies in the United States. And then both the US and Europe have different approaches when it comes to increasing the milk productions in cows. While they are banned in Europe, Australia, Canada, and Israel, they are allowed in the US, and there's just no labeling requirements for milk from these cows, which is a huge concern because people want to know like what's in the milk. Safety measures in the US and Europe. So, in the United States, the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, operates under a reactive system which allows unnecessary chemicals and additives into foods unless it is proven to be harmful. And then in Europe, the EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, takes a preventative and proactive approach. They require all chemicals and additives to be proven safe and unharmful before being allowed in food production.
Why should you care? This project is very important because of all of the misinformation that is being put out to American citizens like you and me about the food that they put into their bodies. There are so many preservatives, additives, and other substances that are being put into our food and are taking a huge toll on our health without even realizing it. This is going to impact our future children and more generations to come. The FDA is an important stakeholder for this topic due to them making and setting most of our regulations here in the US. Most people may brush off this issue as they don't think that it affects them. Little do we know that we're being more affected than we know. Eating a diet high in fat and sugar, which many Americans do, can contribute to cardiac dysfunction, decreased insulin sensitivity, and worsened symptoms of asthma. This was said in the article The Effects of an American Diet on Health by Courtney Walker. This is the food we're feeding America's children. Stepping into any American grocery store will make it abundantly clear why the American diet is severely lacking. And pictured on the right is photos of just some foods that are being offered and sold in American grocery stores that you've probably seen before. And these photos are from Junk Food Aisle in Grocery Store. That is a collection of photos on Picture Library. Just some personal connections from us to this project. I personally got to spend a lot of summers in Europe when I was growing up, and I have noticed, even being there at a young age, that the norms that many people have for how they plan their meals are very different from the ways that Americans do. For example, there's a lot more fresh produce that is grown and without pesticides being sold at grocery stores. As pictured here on the right, this is a image taken by Lena Polishko in a series of photos from a website called A Grocery Store Filled with Lots of Fresh Produce, which is very simple but very straight to the point. As you can see here in Portugal, there's just a collection of fresh produce, and none of the items that were pictured in the American grocery store example are here. In addition to this, there's also a lot more taking care of animals at people's own homes for fresh meat and dairy that I found through my personal viewing when I visited Europe. In addition, eating out at fast food restaurants in Europe still left me feeling better than if I ate out for a week in America. This is due to, even through fast food, what we call fast food restaurants in Europe, due to all the different restrictions and regulations that they have about the additives and preservatives and all of that. The difference just even can be seen in the fast food restaurants that you may visit in Europe. This is a pathological appeal because there's so many personal connections that can be made, and knowing that this is taken into you personally just makes it more emotionally convicting, because the food that people in Europe are putting into their bodies is so much better for them than the food that we're putting into our bodies here in America. And personally, that strikes me. So you probably are wondering what the future looks like for us in the US, and if the government is working on trying to better our food standards, because it's not fair that Europe has healthier food seemingly than we do. So, where is the US headed with its food standards, and where is Europe? The US is currently talking about lowering the amount of chemicals they put in food, trying to focus on revising the healthy food and what that definition really means. And they're putting a focus on ultra processed foods, potentially leading to changes in dietary guidelines and school meal standards. In the article Final Rule Child Nutrition Programs, Meal Patterns Consistent with the 2020-2025 Dietary Guidelines for Americans from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, it said that in April of 2024, the USDA finalized a rule titled Child Nutrition Programs, Meal Patterns Consistent with the 2020-2025 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And this rule specifically introduces, for the first time in American history, that there should be limits on added sugars in school meals, and further reduces sodium levels. Me being a recent graduate from high school, already I noticed when the food regulations switched a little bit, because during those years, like, they were trading out some of the old foods that they sold in the cafeteria for newer and more healthier food that had limited sugar levels. In addition to this, Europe is also heading even more progressive with its food standards as well. And Europe is aiming towards a more sustainable and environmentally friendly food system, having stricter standards for imports and exports, and a push for organic farming. And this was noted in the organic farming article by European Commission. So although it was already noted that Europe has much stricter regulations on the food, that doesn't mean that they're stopping there. They're still continuing to update and expand upon their already very strict regulations. This just goes to show that the US has a long way to go to catch up with Europe, or even surpass it, with the way that they're deciding to go upon the food that they are serving their citizens.
What should the U.S. be implementing that they aren't already? While the U.S. does have food safety regulations in place, there are different key areas where we are not up to date compared to European standards. First, we need to strengthen our food safety regulations. In Europe, there's a stronger emphasis on the precautionary principle, meaning that if there's any uncertainty about the safety of a food additive or chemical, it's more likely to be banned or restricted. This is known as their hazard-based system. The U.S. often allows these substances until proven harmful, which puts consumers at a big risk. Strengthening these laws can ensure that our food is not only accessible, but also safe and sustainable. Another issue that we face in the U.S. is the overuse of chemicals in our food supply, including pesticides, insecticides, and artificial additives like red 40 dye, which is banned or restricted in Europe but commonly found in American food products. These chemicals can lead to serious health issues over time, and limiting their use would be a step toward better public health in America. Public education is also extremely important. Many Americans don't realize that the food that they're eating includes ingredients that are banned overseas or could be harmful to them potentially. Increasing awareness of these things can lead to a consumer deficit and eventually regulatory change. Lastly, the U.S. primarily uses a risk-based system, which focuses on how much of a harmful substance might be safe. Europe, however, uses a hazard-based system, which focuses on whether a substance could cause harm, regardless of the dosage. Adopting more of this hazard-based approach could help the U.S. prioritize prevention and safety in the long run. There's a lot that we could use from the European system to make our food safer for the environment. And then this is a video that we chose, and we think that it sums up our project a lot.
American food is banned in Europe. Certain food companies here, if they decide to sell their food in Europe, they have to change the ingredient. That's why you have a Mexican Coca-Cola. The ingredients, they won't allow high fructose corn syrup in their country. Pesticides are another issue, because if you're eating processed food, you're eating pesticide. And the second most prevalent pesticide is atrazine. You probably heard the study where the male frog was converted into a female frog. The men parts were disappearing. And that's the second most common pesticide in the U.S., which is banned in Europe.
And an explanation of some of our podcast quotes that help support. So these are two podcasts that we found that both support our project and our cause. So the first one is a podcast from Gastropod. It talks all about the European versus U.S. food standards and regulations. There are multiple times where the hosts say that America should try to adopt the methods that Europe uses when it comes to food quality. One quote that I like from this podcast is, "All those new chemicals that were being added to food at the time to keep it fresh, were they safe? And what about today? The preservatives in our food now, are they safe?" I think this shows that the people of the US and consumers don't know what they're eating, and it's honestly harmful to our health, because if we don't know what we're eating, then what's in it, and that could just be very damaging. And then the second podcast is from the Upbeat Dietitians and talks all about banned foods in Europe that we are told are safe to eat in the US. Some of these include Red 40 diet and too. This is very interesting to me since these are very common foods in our daily diets in the US. And one quote from their podcast was, "The European Food Safety Authority does not closely monitor the levels of uric acid, which is omega-9 monounsaturated fatty acid in canola oil, and it does set limits on its content in food products, so it's not banned." So that's something that they do that maybe we could adopt in the US. And I just thought that was a very good quote that showed like consumers seeing that there needs to be a change in our country and to our food regulations.
Are restaurants up to food standards? Restaurants are subject to food safety regulations, which cover various aspects like food handling, storage, preparation, and serving. Some food chains do not completely live up to the food standards. Several restaurants have been identified as potentially using food packaging and ingredients containing harmful chemicals. Studies have found that PFAS, or also known as forever chemicals, in the packaging of fast food items like McDonald's Big Mac containers and Burger King Whopper wrappers. Many food chains have claimed that they plan on removing these forever chemicals from their company. The future for the U.S. The United States has recently taken food safety into consideration again after several deadly outbreaks occurred in the early 2000s. To improve food standards, the U.S. needs to focus on strengthening food safety regulations, promoting healthy food access and affordability, and encouraging sustainable and responsible food production practices. The future for the U.S. and its food standards can become increasingly better if they actually put what these chemicals are doing into account. Conclusion. We hope by including all of these things in our project, we can help bring awareness to different things being put into our bodies. The more people know about food standards and regulations, the better off our society is. We can help everyone who listens to become healthier and happier. While listening to this, we hope to have showed you guys the different food standards and how they can affect our bodies.